Dr. Hardgrove for PSMN511 Pastoral Ministry, Week 7, using Bill Scheidler's Pastoral Ministry Student Guide and Teaching Handbook. This week, we'll cover lessons 11 and 12 from the study guide. This lesson deals with ministerial confidentiality. Now, quote from Church Law and Tax, which is a good guide in terms of legal issues related to pastoral ministries. They note that clergy can be liable for disclosing communication shared with them in confidence to others without the permission of the counselee, which means if you counsel someone and they don't give you permission to share it, and you do, you could find yourself in court. The concepts of privilege and confidentiality are closely related. Generally, confidentiality refers to a duty not to disclose to anyone the substance of communication shared in confidence. And while the impropriety of disclosing confidential information is universally acknowledged, few clergy have been found legally accountable for unauthorized disclosures. This is because until recently, the duty of clergy to preserve confidences was considered to be a moral rather than legal in nature. In other words, in the past, the courts didn't want to deal with it. They felt like that was an ecclesiastical issue. But more recently, the courts have taken it up because there's implied confidentiality typically when someone comes to a pastor with confidential information. And so there have been pastors who've been sued. I know a minister within my own denomination who was counseling a woman, I think it was marriage counseling, and she confided in the pastor that she was having an affair on her husband. And the pastor told her, either you tell your husband or I'll tell your husband, because he needs to know this is a violation of your covenant of marriage. And she refused to do it, and he told her husband, and she sued, and she won the court case. And I think the pastor was going to appeal, and I don't know how that ultimately turned out. But lawyers are more than willing to take on these kind of cases nowadays because, for one thing, churches have insurance. Our church has insurance. It goes up to right at $1 million, I believe, for counseling issues where someone would try to sue a church saying the counseling was faulty or there was some kind of violation of trust. So lawyers are aware of that, and so now, in the past, they wouldn't take it on because they felt like the church had no money and it wasn't beneficial to them, but now lawyers are increasingly more likely to take on these cases because they believe that there is money to be had. And there are all kinds of confidentiality dilemmas that a pastor faces. Someone comes to you and says, I want to tell you something, but I don't want you to tell another soul. What do you say at that point before you even know what it is? Do you say yes? Do you say no? Do you say tell me, and then I'll tell you whether or not I'm going to keep it confidential? A child comes, or a teenager, and says, don't tell my parents, but I'm pregnant. Or a young man may come and say, don't tell my parents, but I got a young woman pregnant. Youth pastors often find themselves in these kind of dilemmas. The youth often feel comfortable around a youth pastor and feel, that they're friends, probably more so than a senior pastor would. And so they'll often confide, and then it puts a youth pastor in some serious dilemmas. For example, youth may come to the pastor and say, hey, my parents don't know it yet, but I believe I'm gay. And there's a situation where a child just may need some counseling, but the youth pastor finds himself in a very difficult situation if he feels like he can't talk to the parents about it. We'll talk some more about this. Someone says, no one knows this, and I want you to promise that this information will never leave this room, but I plan to get an abortion. So maybe it's a married woman whose husband doesn't know that she's pregnant, and you know he's always wanted a child. Someone comes and says, "Pastor, I know I can trust you not to say anything to anyone. I was drunk, I was driving, and I killed someone and I drove off. Pastor, I came to you in confidence and I know you will not divulge any of this information to anyone. I'm having an affair with my boss at work." These are kind of questions. What happens when you tell someone you can trust me and then they unload something like these questions? How do you deal with it? The subject of confidentiality has two sides, as pastors and leaders will be challenged in two separate but equally important ways. One is when to be quiet or when to keep silent, to keep that confidentiality, and the other is when to say something. Legally, I think in many states, and Georgia is one of them, if a pastor, a youth pastor, a children's church pastor becomes aware that a child is being sexually abused or physically abused, then they're legally required to report this. There's no confidentiality on that. And each state has its own laws with respect to what can be held in confidence as a counselor, as a pastor. And so it's incumbent upon any pastor to find out from their own context, from their own state, what can be held in confidence and what must legally be reported. Because if a child tells you that they're being abused and you don't say anything, it could be years later. It could be 15, 20 years later that they say, I told my pastor, and they never said anything. You could find yourself in a court case when you're thinking about retiring. So these are some serious issues that we have to know what the law is, and not just legally, but morally, what's right to do. In the case of my friend who told the woman's husband that his wife was cheating, he had a conflict. He felt it was his moral duty to tell this man about his wife cheating. But then there was the legal issue where the court said that was told in confidence as unto a counselor, and therefore you can be held legally liable for sharing this information with their husband. So sometimes you have this moral and legal conflict, and as a pastor, you really have to pray and think about how you navigate those kind of issues. Ecclesiastes tells us there is a time to keep silent. When is it? Well, a pastor must be trustworthy, reliable, loyal. And we talk about confidentiality. Confidential means having secret, private relations, confidential, as in a counseling relationship, trusted and intimate, something that is imparted in confidence, that is secret, such as confidential information. Confidential can mean disposed to confide in another, or someone who's likely to confide in another. In government functions, it means classified or maybe top secret information. Confidential is from Latin, from two words, con meaning with, and fidel, which means faith, essentially, with faith. It's different words related to confidential. Confident, people should feel confident that you'll protect them and their interests. Confidence, people should have confidence in leaders that they can be trusted, not to use their issue for a case study or sermon illustration. That's an egregious violation of trust, even if you don't use the names. If you're preaching and you bring out, say, something along the lines, well, I knew this person once that did this, that, and the other, and they're sitting right there, and they know you're talking about them. Just because you didn't use their name doesn't make it any more embarrassing for them. Our relationship should be guided by three scriptural laws with respect to confidentiality. One is the law of love. Love for the person, love for the people that are impacted by the information. So the law of love has to be there. So it can't be a personal vendetta. It can't be getting even with somebody. It can't be motivated by anything like that. Always, these decisions have to be motivated by love, the law of faithfulness, that we are someone who is faithful to our calling, faithful to our role as a pastor, faithful to the person, faithful to God. Then there's a law of edification. Is this going to help build them up, strengthen them in their walk with the Lord? Or is it something that would hurt their walk with the Lord? We need to think about how we or what we share based on how it might affect them. Is my sharing this information building this person up or tearing them down? I have to be committed to building them up. Scheidler talks about the 7 sins of the tongue that we should avoid. One is tale-bearing, that is breaking trust and confidence. In other words, telling stuff that we shouldn't be telling. Backbiting is speaking bad about a person or people behind their back. Gossip is speaking about the affairs of others with bad intent. In other words, you're not trying to help anybody. You just like knowing something that nobody else knows, and so you share it. Whispering, which is secretly, that should be plotting with another against another person. Bitterness, speaking about others with bad feelings. Maybe you're mad at them or your feelings have been hurt, and so you talk about them. Coarse jesting, that means speaking of serious issues frivolously, or maybe even using language that is inappropriate for a pastor. Slander is speaking falsehoods that damage another's reputation. These are 7 sins of the tongue that certainly a pastor and no Christian should be guilty of. How do we live out our Christian duty? Number 1 is watch what you share, even with your spouse and other leaders on matters in council. There are some things that I won't even share with my wife if someone tells me in the church. So I've had situations where people said, Pastor, I want to share something with you, but this is very confidential. A case of someone was abused, maybe as a child or whatever, and they want to share with the pastor, but they really don't want it to go any further. And when I sense that very absolute, don't tell anybody, I don't even share it with my wife. Often, she may find out from them or from someplace else, and I think it always looks good on a pastor if that person then goes to my wife and says, I don't know if you knew about this. And then my wife is able to say, no, I don't know anything about it. And they may say something along the lines, well, I told your husband, and she would say, he didn't say anything to me. That really builds confidence. Now, it may be a situation where you feel like you need to talk to your spouse, and you just ask them up front, would it be okay if I talk to my wife about this and nobody else? And my wife is always very good at. Now, if your wife isn't good at keeping confidentiality, then don't share anything with them. My wife is very good at that. Be careful at home, and especially in front of children, not to discuss the problems of people. So if you're home and you do share it with your wife, and you have permission to share it with your wife, but then you do it with your children there, not thinking about it, you think they're watching television or playing on their smartphone, but they're hearing it. And then they tell another child, that can really come back to cause problems. It's also good not to repeat stories of failures of pastors, especially when you don't have all the facts, which we rarely do. It demeans the office of the pastor when we talk about the failures of other pastors in front of our church members or our family. So we don't want to do that. Do not allow requests for prayer to become a cover for gossip. So sometimes people ask for prayer, and really what they're wanting to do is share something. I really need to pray for Sister so-and-so. I saw her out the other day with a bottle of whiskey in her hand, and I just feel like we should pray for her. Really, they're just wanting to gossip. Do not use your people and their problems in joking with other ministers. Even if you feel like it's never going to get back to them, you really never know. Especially with Facebook nowadays, people will post stuff and you think you're telling a pastor something that's never going to get out, but then they tell their wife posted on Facebook, and then it comes back and you're in trouble. Proverbs 25 verses 9 and 10 in the New International Version say, if you take your neighbor to court, do not betray another's confidence, or the one who hears it may shame you, and the charge against you will stand. So that kind of confidence in terms of what's been shared with you needs to be held. Otherwise, you may in fact find yourself in court and be held accountable. There are three commitments, basic commitments at all times. First of all, there's a commitment to the flock, to the people in your church. There has to be a commitment of confidentiality that they know is there with their pastor, which allows them to come when they really have serious issues that they need to share. Obviously, there's a commitment to the Lord. We need to understand that we have made a commitment in terms of our role and responsibility as a pastor, and we need to keep that commitment. Then there's a commitment to the office of pastor. How we comport ourselves, how we carry ourselves and conduct the business of pastor affects how people look at the role of a pastor at large. And if we do damage to that by being frivolous or lacking the ability to keep confidentialities or betraying trust, it damages not only ourselves as a pastor, but how people may look at other pastors. And it does damage to, as it says here, the office of pastor. So we have a duty to act as a professional to help people make it easy to place confidence in their spiritual leaders. So one of the things you do is make your office soundproof. So you don't want a secretary outside necessarily hearing everything that's going on. And I would always be very cautious about counseling someone of the opposite sex in my office without someone of the of the same sex as that person, a woman close by. Sometimes if it's a woman who needs counseling, I will ask if I can bring my wife in. I never counsel a woman alone in my office unless I might leave my door open. There's nobody out there and I leave the door open. But you got to be very, very careful. A friend of mine, he was a pastor of counseling at a church I was on staff at. He had a machine that creates something called white noise. Some people use it to sleep with. He set it outside his office, so it kind of canceled out the sound of their conversation. You don't want the waiting area outside the place of counseling to be busy. If that's the case, you may need to find a different place for counseling, a quiet room. But again, you don't want it to be too secluded, especially not if you're going to be with someone of the opposite sex. If you take notes from counseling, you need to make sure that these are under lock and key. If you take physical notes, handwritten, if you do it on your computer, make sure you only have the password. Always avoid referring to these cases in sermons or illustrations. And if you need to get advice from someone, then ask the person. Let them know, listen, I know I have a friend that has dealt with this situation with someone else. Would you mind if I share it with them? I'll share it anonymously. I won't give them your name. But would it be okay if I talk to my friend, my fellow pastor or counselor, to just get some insights? And if they give you permission, then it's fine. If they don't, then you don't do it. So there's time to be quiet, but then there's a time to speak. There is what's called the myth of the confession booth, because there are times when pastors must testify. This idea that someone who said something to you in counseling, you never have to go to court or you'll never be required to testify, isn't true. There are times when you can be held, as I've already said, to testify. So In the Bible, it talks about when someone's planning to apostatize, so someone's planning to just desert Christ altogether and leave the church. You might want to bring that to your counsel, and according to the Bible, you have an opportunity to do that, to say, hey, brothers, or your elders, I can tell this person's faith is fading. They've shared some things with me, and I feel like that they're about to leave, to abandon their faith. And what can we do as a church family to help encourage them and strengthen them? When someone's committed murder, that doesn't have to be held in confidence. You can and you should report that. When you knew the facts concerning other crimes that have been committed. So there are certain crimes, especially as I said, abuse, child abuse, other crimes where you're not shielded by the fact that you're a pastor, and they can call upon you to testify in court. Also, biblical limits to confidentiality. On the issue of repentance and reconciliation, sometimes it's necessary to include others. The Bible talks about if someone has created this problem in the church, you take it to one or two people, and then if they won't hear that, then you take it to the church body. There's the issue of authority. This is an important one here. So if a child comes to you and wants to share with you that they feel like they're gay or something like that, you have to point them back to their parents. You need to discuss this with your parents. You can't entertain those kind of conversations and disregard God's chain of command, if you will, of the child and the authority of the parents to that child. You should never counsel a child to do something that you feel like wouldn't be acceptable to their parents. Again, always point them back to their parents. There's an issue of exposing rather than covering. There's time to expose a sin. Must commit to covering a sin that's been properly dealt with. If someone's dealt with it, they've been forgiven. We're not talking about breaking the law. We're talking about moral failures, and they've dealt with it. Then it's responsibility of the preacher to keep that covered, to not to expose it. Sin that is hidden without being dealt with, however, is to be exposed. Again, as Jesus said, taking it to two or three. So something going on in the church. For example, there was a young lady in our choir who was living with a man. Actually, her mother called the choir director and told him, and then he came and told me. So he wasn't, again, violating anything. It was kind of chain of command for him to come to me and ask me what I thought he should do, and I told him he needed to speak with her and tell her that we love her. We're not trying to run her off, but there's a certain standard in terms of being on the podium or the stage in the church, and in terms of any leadership in the church, there's a certain moral standard that we try to maintain as examples, and that includes the choir. And in fact, he told her that, and of course, she got upset and she left the church. And sadly, she was a young woman. 3 months later, she died. She dropped dead. I think it might have been diabetes, and it was really sad. And here's something that's important that I think Scheidler really helps us with. So if someone says, I want you to keep this under complete confidence, you may have to stop before they say anything and just let them know what your policy is. Listen, and I can't expound what that might be for you, but for me, if it involves, again, anything that's illegal that needs to be reported, I may have to let them know, listen, I may have to legally be required to report abuse and things. Now, the challenge with that is that then they may not tell anybody and the abuse may continue. I had a situation in my church in Kansas where there was a family of about 5 or 6 children, all of them pretty small. The oldest was a 13-year-old girl, and their mother was already in prison. Some of the kids were not the biological offspring of the father. They were the step kids, including the 13-year-old. And she came to my associate pastor and told him that her stepfather was molesting her. And so he called me and asked me what to do. And I said, take her right from your office, take her directly to the police station and have her tell them. And of course, the dad was arrested and the children were put in foster homes, but at least they were taken out of that abusive situation. So you have to let people know, listen, everything's not going to be under an ironclad agreement of complete blanket confidentiality. There may be times when you may need to talk to your wife, or you may need to talk to some of the elders in the church, or you may need to talk to legal authorities, depending on what the issue is. A good policy here is don't keep probing, asking to know more than you need to know. Just allow people to share what they want to share, and don't go around and become some kind of private detective trying to find out more. And again, on these kind of issues where it's something that needs to be reported, the first line would be to encourage the man or woman themselves to explain to them from a Christian point of view. They really need to, as we say, turn themselves in. So let's say they hit someone along the road and then they drove off. They were scared, whatever the situation was, and they drove off. And now they're telling you in tears, and you just need to let them know, hey, you need to report this. And if you want me to go with you to the police station, I'll go with you, but you have to report this. So you encourage them to report it to the authorities. But ultimately, you have to be a pastor that's known for having sealed lips. Other than those special circumstances where you need to speak, other than that, you need to be known for someone who does not break confidences, because it will ruin you as a pastor.